All right, so today we are really diving deep, and I mean deep, into Hezbollah. And by the looks of it, you've definitely prepped for this one. You've even got the Hezbollah Wikipedia page printed out. We both know that's a black hole of information in itself.
Oh, it definitely is. And you're spot on. Even Wikipedia, which tries so hard to be neutral, it still points out all the different labels people use for Hezbollah.
Right. Like, what are they really?
Hmm.
Political party, militant group, social movement. It's almost like none of those quite fit.
It's true. They're complex. But to really get a grasp on Hezbollah, we have to go back in time to the 1980s, Lebanon in the thick of civil war, facing Israeli intervention, and that's where Hezbollah comes in.
So saying resistance is important to them is kind of an understatement then.
Definitely. See, they had backing from Iran's Revolutionary Guard, and they formed specifically to oppose the Israeli occupation of southern Lebanon. You absolutely can't separate their origins, that resistance, from everything they do, everything they believe.
Okay, let's break down that ideology a bit. We know they're deeply rooted in Shia Islam, and we've talked about resistance, but how does that actually play out? What does it look like?
Well, for Hezbollah, resistance has often meant armed struggle, especially against Israel. In the beginning, their goal was clear: get Israeli forces out of Lebanon, which, by the way, they achieved in 2000. But it doesn't end there. They see Western influence, especially from the U.S., as another kind of threat that they need to resist.
So it's bigger than just one country or a conflict. They see themselves as pushing back against Western dominance as a whole.
You got it. And here's where things get really interesting. They started with conflict and resistance, but Hezbollah's goals, they haven't stayed the same. They've evolved. They're not just about armed struggle anymore. Now they're involved in Lebanese politics. They provide social services. It's a multi-pronged approach.
Wait, hold on. They're running hospitals and schools. That doesn't exactly scream militant group. What's the strategy there?
That's the thing about a hybrid organization. They know how to be effective on multiple fronts. It's like they've got this whole toolkit from the political arena to social programs to military strength, and each one has a purpose ready to use when they need it.
So it's not just about winning battles, it's about winning over the people, too.
Absolutely. Their social service network, especially in Shia communities, it's vast. Healthcare, education, even financial aid they're providing where the Lebanese government often doesn't, and that makes a difference.
That's smart building support by
Yeah.
actually doing things, not just talking about it. But let's get into their political power. They're a major force in Lebanon's parliament, right? How do they get so much influence in such a complicated system?
They've played the political game really well, that's for sure. They haven't backed down from Lebanon's messy and, let's be honest, often chaotic political scene. Instead, they've used it to their advantage. They've secured parliamentary seats and even been part of coalition governments.
It's amazing how far they've come from their start as mainly a military organization. It's fascinating. They've shifted their strategies without losing sight of who they are at their core.
It's a tough balancing act. They're a powerful non-state actor. Their military strength rivals actual national armies. And at the same time, they're a significant political player within Lebanon's government.
It's like holding two completely different cards, and somehow they're playing both of them well. But how did they build up that military strength?
Well, they've had consistent support from Iran and Syria for decades. I mean, weapons, training, resources, the whole package. That backing is how they've managed to acquire such a powerful arsenal. We're talking sophisticated rockets and missiles that can hit deep inside Israel.
That's some serious firepower, especially for a group that isn't a country itself.
Yeah.
It really makes you think twice about how we define power, you know?
Yeah.
Hezbollah, they can actually pose a real military challenge to a nation state.
It really throws a wrench in how we usually think about these things. I mean,
Yeah.
the traditional idea of a state, it's all about having that sole right to use force. Hezbollah throws that whole concept out the window.
And we're not just talking about theory here, right?
Yeah.
This blurring of lines has real consequences, especially when you consider how Hezbollah's military strength affects how they're seen globally. Some countries call them a terrorist organization. Others say they're a legitimate resistance force. How do you even make sense of those two completely opposite views?
It really depends on your perspective, where you're standing, both literally and figuratively. For a lot of Western countries, especially the US and Canada, it's Hezbollah's armed actions, their suspected involvement in attacks outside Lebanon's borders. That's what gets them labeled as terrorists.
And those labels, they aren't just words, right? There are actual consequences.
Oh, absolutely. We're talking sanctions, restrictions on moving money, all designed to isolate Hezbollah. But here's the thing. Those measures often end up hurting Lebanon as a whole.
A double-edged sword, then. But on the flip side, Inside Lebanon, and even in much of the Arab world, Hezbollah is seen as a defense against Israeli aggression, even a champion against Western influence.
It just goes to show how one group can be seen in totally different ways. It's about the stories we tell, the historical context, and honestly, deeply rooted beliefs about the region.
And then, as if things weren't complicated enough, you've got the Syrian conflict thrown into the mix.
Yeah, when they decided to enter the Syrian war, fighting alongside Assad's regime, it really divided international opinion.
Because for some, it confirmed that Hezbollah was a dangerous player, carrying out Iran's agenda in a much bigger power struggle.
Exactly right. But then there are those who argue that Hezbollah just wanted to stabilize the region to fight against extremist groups like ISIS. And to be fair, their involvement in Syria, it's even a point of debate within Lebanon itself.
We've covered their military power, their political clout, but there's this elephant in the room we can't ignore: Lebanon's economic crisis. Looking at the research, how big of a role would you say Hezbollah plays in the country's economic troubles?
It's almost impossible to separate Hezbollah's actions from the larger economic mess. But pinning all the blame on them, that's way too simplistic. Lebanon's economic problems, they come from this perfect storm of corrupt government, terrible management, and a mountain of debt.
But it's not like Hezbollah is completely innocent, is it?
You're right. Some economists argue that by getting involved in regional conflicts, especially the Syrian war, Hezbollah has drained Lebanon's resources and scared off foreign investment. Then you have others pointing to their control over certain parts of the economy construction, import-export, saying that creates an uneven playing field and chokes competition.
It's like trying to patch a small leak while a pipe bursts in the basement. The government's already struggling, and then you've got this non-state actor with their own plans and resources. It's a recipe for disaster, which is pretty much what we're seeing now.
It's this tangled web of interconnected problems, and to make matters worse, you've got the political gridlock that's plagued Lebanon. Hezbollah's political bloc has been accused of holding up the formation of a functioning government, which delays critical economic reforms.
Which brings us to a very important question. Where does Lebanon go from here? And in this fragile system, what's next for Hezbollah?
Now, those are the million-dollar questions. Some analysts believe that as the economy keeps getting worse and the government stays paralyzed, Hezbollah's influence will just keep growing.
It's almost like they're in a position to become the default authority, even without actually controlling the government completely. A state within a state, almost.
It's a scary thought for some and a real possibility. But some analysts argue that because Hezbollah relies so heavily on Iran, as Iran faces its own economic problems and international pressure, that could become Hezbollah's weakness.
Like a house of cards, one wrong move and the whole thing collapses.
Exactly. And then there's the issue of internal unity. As Hezbollah changes, trying to balance its military wing with its political and social agendas, it might become really difficult to keep everyone on the same page.
So there's a chance they could split apart from within, especially if the pressure from outside keeps building, or if Lebanon's political landscape shifts dramatically.
That's definitely something to keep in mind. One thing's for sure, though, trying to predict Hezbollah's future is impossible. It really is. Like, we're putting together this massive puzzle, and just when you think you've found the right spot for a piece, it changes shape right in front of you.
And it's a puzzle that makes us rethink how power really works. How does a group like Hezbollah, which isn't even a country, gain so much legitimacy, not just from their own people, but within a whole political system?
That's a question a lot of people have tried to answer. I think it comes back to that hybrid nature we were talking about, the social services they run, the way they participate in politics, how good they are at mobilizing support. Those aren't just about fighting, they're about building something.
It's like they've almost created this model for success, especially in a region struggling with so much division and unrest.
In a way, they've tapped into this deep resentment against Israel and the West, but they've paired it with actual results, tangible benefits for their people. That's powerful.
But is it sustainable? Can a model that seems to thrive on conflict and perceived threats really be a path to lasting stability?
The million-dollar question. What happens if those threats fade away? What if there's a huge change on the world stage? Could Hezbollah hold on to their power, their influence, without that constant struggle, that resistance?
It's like their whole identity, the very reason they exist, is tied to having an enemy.
That's a debate that comes up a lot. And it leads to another big question. How could Hezbollah's approach affect the rest of the Middle East? If other groups see them as a success story, could they try to do the same thing? Wouldn't that mean even more division and instability?
That's a pretty sobering thought. What starts with one group could easily spread, like a domino effect of instability across the entire region.
And it's a scenario that policymakers are definitely worried about. It shows how crucial it is to look beyond the surface, to understand the root causes, the historical factors, everything that leads to groups like Hezbollah emerging in the first place.
Because if we don't get that, any attempt to solve these problems will just be a Band-Aid solution.
Exactly. We've got to connect the dots, see the whole picture, and realize that there are no simple answers when it comes to a place as complex as the Middle East.
So as we wrap up this deep dive into Hezbollah, what's the one big takeaway you want our listeners to walk away with today?
Hezbollah is a force to be reckoned with, a major player in Middle Eastern politics. But they're not so easily defined. They're a fascinating mix of contradictions, a group with a rich history, and a future that's still being written. Don't just accept the headlines or one-sided stories. Get into it, challenge what you think you know, and never stop trying to understand more deeply.
It's about embracing the complexities, fighting that urge to simplify everything, and always being open to learning and thinking critically. And on that note, we'll wrap up this deep dive. Thanks for joining us, and we'll catch you.